Open theism, also known as openness theology and free will theism, is a theological movement that has developed within evangelical and post-evangelical Protestant Christianity as a response to certain ideas related to the synthesis of Greek philosophy and Christian theology. It is typically advanced as a biblically motivated and philosophically consistent theology of human and divine freedom, with an emphasis on what this means for the content of God's foreknowledge and exercise of God's power. It has been said that open theism triggered the most significant controversy about the doctrine of God in evangelical thought in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Exposition of open theism. In short, open theism says that since God and humans are free, God's knowledge is dynamic and God's providence flexible. While several versions of traditional theism would picture God's knowledge of the future as a singular, fixed trajectory, open theism would see it as a plurality of branching possibilities, with some possibilities becoming settled as time moves forward. Thus, the future as well as God's knowledge of it is open. Other versions of classical theism hold that God fully determines the future, entailing that there is no free choice. Yet other versions of classical theism hold that even though there is freedom of choice, God's omniscience necessitates God foreknowing what free choices are made. Open theists hold that these versions of classical theism are out of sync with the biblical concept of God, the biblical understanding of divine and creaturely freedom, and/or result in incoherence. Open theists tend to emphasize that God's most fundamental character trait is love, and that this trait is unchangeable. They also tend to hold that the biblical portrait is of a God deeply moved by creation, experiencing a variety of feelings in response to it. Comparison of open and reformed theism. The following chart compares beliefs about key doctrines as stated by open theists and Calvinists after the period of controversy between adherents of the two theisms began in 1994. During this period, the theology of open theism rocked the evangelical world. Historical development. Open theists have named open theism precursors to document their assertion that the open view of the future is not a recent concept, but has a long history. The first known post-biblical Christian writings advocating concepts similar to open theism with regard to the issue of foreknowledge are found in the writings of Chalcidius, a 4th century interpreter of Plato. It was affirmed in the 16th century by Socinus, and in the early 18th century by Samuel Fancourt and by Andrew Ramsay. In the 19th century, several theologians wrote in defense of this idea, including Isaac August Dorner, Gustav Fechner, Otto Pfleiderer, Jules Lequia, Adam Clarke, Billy Hibbard, Joel Hayes, T.W. Brent, and Lorenzo D. McCabe. Contributions to this defense increased as the century drew to a close. Millard Erickson belittles such precursors to open theism as virtually unknown or unnoticed. After 1980, the term open theism was introduced in 1980 with theologian Richard Rice's book The Openness of God, the relationship of divine foreknowledge and human free will. The broader articulation of open theism was given in 1994, when 5 essays were published by evangelical scholars under the title The Openness of God. Recent theologians of note espousing this view include Clark Pinnock, Greg Boyd, Thomas J. Ord, John E. Sanders, Dallas Willard, Jürgen Moltmann, Richard Rice, Peter Wagner, John Polkinghorne, Hendrikus Berkhoff, Adrio Koenig, Harry Borg, Bethany Solerader, Matt Parkins, Thomas Finger, Norris Clark, Brian Hebblethwaite, Robert Ellis, Kenneth Archer, Barry Callan, Henry Knight III, Gordon Olson, and Winky Pratney. A significant, growing number of philosophers of religion affirm it. Peter Vane and Wagin, Richard Swinburne, William Hasker, David Basinger, Nicholas Walterstorff, Dean Zimmerman, Timothy O'Connor, Sergei Bulgakov, James D. Ritzler, Keith Derrissey, Richard D. Creel, Robin Collins, R. Lucas, Vincent Brummer, Peter Geach, Richard Pertil, N. Pryor, Alan Roeder, Jeffrey Kopersky, Dale Tuggy, and Keith Ward. Biblical scholars Terence E. Fretheim, Karen Winslow, and John Golding affirm it. Others include writers Madeleine L'Engle and Paul C. Borgman, mathematician D.J. Bartholomew, and biochemist, theologian Arthur Peacock. The dynamic omniscience view has been affirmed by a number of non-Christians as well. Cicero, Alexander of Aphrodisias, and Porphyry. God's statement to Abraham, "Now I know that you fear me," was much discussed by medieval Jewish theologians. Two significant Jewish thinkers who affirmed dynamic omniscience as the proper interpretation of the passage were Ibn Ezra and Gersonides. Philosophical arguments. Open theists maintain that traditional classical theists hold the classical attributes of God together in an incoherent way. The main classical attributes are as follows. All good. God is the standard of moral perfection, all benevolent, and perfectly loving. Simplicity. God has no parts, cannot be differentiated, and possesses no attribute as distinct from his being. Immutability. God cannot change in any respect. Impassibility. God cannot be affected by outside forces. Omnipresence. God is present everywhere, or more precisely, all things find their location in God. Omniscience. God knows absolutely everything, believes all truths and disbelieves all falsehoods. God's knowledge is perfect. Omnipotence. God can do anything. Contradictions in the traditional attributes are pointed out by open theists and atheists alike. Atheist author and educator George H. Smith writes in his book Atheism, the case against God, that if God is omniscient, meaning God knows the future, God cannot be omnipotent, meaning God can do anything, because if God knew the future with infallible certainty, he cannot change it, in which case he cannot be omnipotent. If God can change the future, however, he cannot have infallible knowledge of it. While this argument has historically been used by some open theists, currently most open theists affirm that God knows the future perfectly, but simply deny God believes the future is fixed. Such open theists would still use the argument if the referent of the future is that of a complete and unchanging future. Some traditional theists would respond to the above argument by pointing out that God is the author of the future, and thus there is no more contradiction in saying God knows the future and is sovereign over it than in saying Shakespeare was free to make Romeo and Juliet as he would. But having made it, he is not free to make it different from how he had. However, this response is only available to classical theists who believe God determines the entirety of the future. A traditional theist would also postulate that since God is omniscient, God would also know every possible future. But while this response is available to traditional theists who reject determinism, it creates a problem for traditional free will theists who think God knows the future to be linear and static, because there would be a mismatch between God's linear understanding of the future and the dynamic, branching future itself. Open theism also answers the question of how God can be blameless and omnipotent even though evil exists in the world. H. Roy Elseth gives an example of a parent that knows with certainty that his child would go out and murder someone if he was given a gun. Elseth argues that if the parent did give the gun to the child, then the parent would be responsible for that crime. However, if God was unsure about the outcome, then God would not be culpable for that act, only the one who committed the act would be guilty. This position is, however, dubious, as a parent who knows his child was probable, or likely, or even possibly going to shoot someone would be culpable, and God knew that it was likely that man would sin, and thus God is still culpable. An Orthodox Christian might try, on the contrary, seek to ground a theodicy in the resurrection, both of Christ and the general resurrection to come, though this is not the traditional answer to evil. Another position put forth by Orthodox Christians is to point out that God is the ultimate lawgiver, and thus there exists no objective standard of good or evil above God regulating God. Therefore, the so-called problem of evil, which presupposes such an independent standard, is not an objection that a Bible-believing Christian has to respond to. Another claim made by open theists is that the traditional understanding of providence is incompatible with a real love relationship with God. It is claimed that for someone to have a real love relationship, it must be give and take. Each member opens themselves up and becomes vulnerable. They point out that God, throughout the Bible, is shown as grieving over Israel's rebellion. They claim that if the future was known to be fixed, then Israel could not have freely chosen to rebel and God could not be genuinely grieving. Knowing that this was the only possibility, Israel's actions would have been set in stone millennia before they were ever born. They would have been compelled by fate or providence to take those actions. This would be the same as a relationship between a programmer and computer. Open theists, such as John Sanders, claim that the only way a relationship can be real is if there is freedom to choose. It should be noted that open theists believe God's infinite intelligence affords him an infinite understanding of all possibilities in the universe. God, therefore, is never caught off guard by any event which comes to pass, but is perfectly prepared. Varieties of open theists. Philosopher Alan Roeder has described several different approaches several open theists have taken with regard to the future and God's knowledge of it. Voluntary nescience. The future is alethically settled but nevertheless epistemically open for God because he has voluntarily chosen not to know truths about future contingents. Dallas Willard was thought to hold this position. Involuntary nescience. The future is alethically settled but nevertheless epistemically open for God because truths about future contingents are in principle unknowable. William Hasker, Peter Van Inwagen, and Richard Swinburne espouse this position. Non-bivalentist omniscience. The future is alethically open and therefore epistemically open for God because propositions about future contingents are neither true nor false. J.R. Lucas and Dale Tuggy espouse this position. Bivalentist omniscience. The future is alethically open and therefore epistemically open for God because propositions asserting of future contingents that they will obtain, or that they will not obtain are both false. Instead, what is true is that they might and might not obtain. Greg Boyd and Arthur Pryor hold this position. Criticism. Open theism has been strongly criticized by some Protestant, especially Calvinist, theologians and ministers. Some of these opponents include Bruce A. Ware, Tom Schreiner, John Frame, John Piper, Millard Erickson, and Norman Geisler. Geisler, in his book Creating God in the Image of Man, argues against open theism and in favor of a view which includes all the traditional attributes of God. He quotes Exodus chapter 3 verse 14 and claims that it establishes God's aseity. From there, Geisler deduces simplicity, necessity, immutability, impassibility, eternity, and unity. While open theists would affirm God's aseity, they would derive this attribute on other grounds, and deny that it entails all the attributes Geisler thinks it does. Geisler also addresses the claims that the classical attributes were derived from the Greeks with three observations. The quest for something unchanging is not bad. The Greeks did not have the same concept of God. Philosophical influences are not wrong in themselves. An open theist would say that all such criticisms are misplaced. As to number 1, it is not characteristic of open theists to say that the quest for something unchanging is bad. Indeed, open theists believe God's character is unchanging. As to number 2, open theists do not characteristically say traditional forms of classical theism have exactly the same concept of God as the Greeks. Rather, they argue that they imported only some unbiblical assumptions from the Greeks. They also point to theologians of the Christian tradition who, throughout history, didn't succumb so strongly to Hellenistic influences. As to number 3, open theists don't argue that philosophical influences are bad in themselves. Rather, they argue that some philosophical influences on Christian theology are unbiblical and theologically groundless. Consider John Sanders' statement in The Openness of God. Christian theology, I am arguing, needs to re-evaluate classical theism in light of a more relational metaphysics so that the living, personal, responsive and loving God of the Bible may be spoken of more consistently in our theological reflection. Opponents of open theism, such as Reformed Baptist pastor John Piper, claim that the verses commonly used by open theists are anthropopathisms. They suggest that when God seems to change from action A to action B in response to prayer, action B was the inevitable event all along, and God divinely ordained human prayer as the means by which God actualized that course of events. They also point to verses that suggest God is immutable, such as Malachi chapter 3 verse 6, For I, the Lord, have not changed, and you, the sons of Jacob, have not reached the end. Numbers chapter 23 verse 19, God is not a man that he should lie, nor is he a mortal that he should relent. Would he say and not do, speak and not fulfill? 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 29. And also, the strength of Israel will neither lie nor repent, for he is not a man to repent. Isaiah chapter 46 verse 10. I tell the end from the beginning, and from before, what was not done. I say, my counsel shall stand, and all my desire I will do. Those advocating the traditional view see these as the verses that form God's character, and they interpret other verses that say God repents as anthropomorphistic. Authors who claim this can be traced back through Calvin, Luther, Aquinas, Ambrose, and Augustine. Open theists note that there seems to be an arbitrary distinction here between those verses which are merely anthropopathic and others which form God's character. They also note that the immediate sense of the passages addressing God's unalterability ought to be understood in the Hebrew sense of his faithfulness and justice. Literary debate in 2005. A raging debate among evangelicals about open or free will theism was in place. This period of controversy began with the publication of The Openness of God in 1994. The debate between open and classical theists is illustrated by their books as in the following chart.